everyone. All right, let's see if this works. It does work. Can you guys hear me? Mic's working? Perfect. Hello, everyone. My name is Dan Robinson. I'm the CEO and founder of Red6. Thank you for your time today. It is great to see you. I must also immediately thank my team who are sitting in the front row, this noisy herd of retrobates in the front row. Particularly my co-founder, Glenn Snyder. I, as the CEO, get to stand up here and tell cool stories about what we've done over the last 4 or 5 years. But the reality of it is it's Glenn and the team that have built this tech. So we're going to take a round of applause right now for these guys. So Red6 has made a breakthrough in augmented reality that for the first time allows it to work outdoors and in the most dynamic environments of all. And that's incredibly significant for us as an industry, but it's also incredibly significant for us as a nation, because we are taking this technology and applying it directly to a use case that I believe, and we believe, represents a national security crisis that actually only augmented reality can solve. And if we just ponder that for a second, we've seen tremendous tech demonstrations here. We know where augmented reality is heading. I guess because we're all here, we believe in the ultimate vision of a consumer metaverse, augmented reality world where we're all connected. But I think if we're being realistic, we'd also accept that that future is 5 to 10 years away at best. And so the question is, how do we get to that future in good shape as companies? And my personal belief is the way we do that is anchoring our development and our technology around solving real-world problems that actually matter, that we care about. And this breakthrough we've made is anchored around one very specific problem that I believe augmented reality and ultimately a metaverse is uniquely positioned to solve. And so that's a good thing for us. So I need to get us on a common sort of language before we move forward and start talking about the metaverse. So first and foremost, can I have a show of hands? Who in the audience has seen Top Gun, number 1? Awesome, this is good. All right, who's seen number 2? Who thinks number 2 is better than number 1? All right, tough audience. Okay, so I'm going to use Top Gun to reference and make this relevant as we go through, and I'll reference some of the things you saw in that movie and explain exactly why that is important and make it relatable to you guys. Secondly, I'd like us all to get on a common definition of a metaverse, and it doesn't need to be the correct definition. You can all come find me in the bar afterwards and debate this, but I think a common language as we move forward will help to make it make sense in terms of what we're thinking and how we're developing. So firstly, I think we could probably all accept that the metaverse architecturally is going to be a combination of hardware, software, compute, protocols, APIs, services, and virtual entities that we can interact with, or virtual assets we can interact with, be it through virtual reality or augmented reality. And it's the latter, augmented reality, that I'm going to place an emphasis on, because I believe the future of the metaverse is going to be augmented reality. I think over time, virtual reality would be considered an interesting subset of augmented reality or mixed reality. The metaverse, to me, is going to involve a ubiquitous layer of metadata, which is superimposed over the real world around us, wherever we go. And that's incredibly important, because if it's wherever we go, it has to be ubiquitous, which means it has to be mobile, which means it has to work in dynamic environments and outdoors. And that's at the center of how we believe the future of augmented reality looks. And it's at the center of our development thesis. The second thing is three key criteria for the behavior and the things that matter inside of the metaverse. And I think for the metaverse to be a metaverse, it has to be persistent, which means it has to continue whether we're inside the metaverse or not. It has to be synchronous with real life, which offers us continuity of experience. If we step inside of it or come out of it, we can step back into the metaverse and it makes sense to us. And I think thirdly, and perhaps most importantly of all, is that the metaverse involves actionable data. And if we make decisions inside of the metaverse that action that data, the consequences of actioning that data must have a function and applicability to our digital selves, but must impact the real world as well. And if it doesn't, it's just a video game. So if you want to grab me in the bar and argue that afterwards, I'm happy to have that discussion. If I ask 100 of you to define the metaverse, I suspect we'll get 100 answers. But that definition is going to be important as we start working through this presentation. So My background, I'm a fighter pilot by background. I started off in the UK. I was 10 years with the Royal Air Force. I was a graduate of fighter weapons school myself, which is Top Gun. And in 2006, I was lucky enough to be selected as the first non-American in the world to fly this airplane. This airplane, for those that are not familiar, is the F-22 Raptor. It's the most capable stealth fighter in the world today. And I joined the 27th Fighter Squadron at Langley Air Force Base with one of my colleagues. He's right here in the red t-shirt, Uncle. And we brought that airplane into operational service together. And that was a huge, huge privilege and tremendous insight into what is, without a doubt, the most capable combat airplane in the world today. And unique in access to some incredible technology, but also some access or insight into some of the problems associated with not just this platform, but with the broader combat air force itself. And what I'm talking about is training, or rather lack thereof for us. You see, the role of a fighter pilot flying, takeoffs, landings, going to airspace, coming back, that's just how we get to work. The work is done once you get to the airspace, and we have to train. And to train, we need someone to train against. And in very simple terms, that involves a pilot, airplane, fuel, logistics, support that goes with that aircraft. And so to fly an F-22, if I told you it's $100,000 an hour to fly one of those airplanes, those costs add up very quickly and it gets very, very expensive. We didn't have enough training when we were flying the F-22, and this was back in 2006 to 2009 timeframe. It's only gotten a whole bunch worse since then. Why is that? 3 reasons. We don't have enough pilots. It's really hard to find us, it's hard to train us, and it's hard to keep us. The front line of the Air Force right now is roughly 2,000 pilots short on the front line. 2,000 pilots. For us to square that corner, we need to be able to produce 1,500 pilots a year. Right now, we're producing about 1,290, so it's getting worse. Secondly, we don't have enough airplanes. In 1991, in the Gulf War, we had about 134 combat squadrons active duty on the front line. Today, we have 55 combat squadrons. So we don't have the airplanes, and we don't have the pilots to provide adversary aircraft to train against. But even if we had the pilots and the airplanes, we don't have the dollars to solve that problem. So it's a really difficult problem for us to overcome. And herein enters augmented reality and the metaverse. And this is really important. And the reason it's really important is even if we had the dollars to solve the pilot shortage and the lack of aircraft we have available to us, 2 things have happened on the world stage in the last 30 years. We've been involved in conflicts in the Middle East for 20 to 30 years. And whilst that thing has happened, geopolitically, you've seen 2 things. The emergence or re-emergence of Russia onto the world stage with, I think we can agree, nefarious intent, not least highlighted by what is going on in Ukraine right now. And secondly, the pace of innovation in China. And that's significant because for the first time in its history, the United States now is presented with a peer adversary that in some ways is on par technologically with us, and in other ways is far ahead of us. And if we're not concerned about that, we're absolutely wrong. And so we need to be able to solve that. The United States Air Force fully understand that this is a problem that cannot be solved with physical airplanes, pilots, and assets. We can't square that corner. So they have been working on a system called Live, Virtual, and Constructive. And Live, Virtual, and Constructive seeks to solve the exact problems I've outlined, the lack of pilots, the lack of airplanes. It is the first foray into what we would describe as a synthetic training environment. Well, what do I mean by that? So it's a blend of live, real pilots and real airplanes, connected to virtual, real pilots in simulators on the ground, but we beam them up into the airspace such that the airplane systems think there is something there. And constructive is in essence the same as virtual, but it's AI-driven algorithms. But the net effect is exactly the same. The airplane, when I'm sitting down and I'm looking at my radar scope, my airplane thinks there are systems or entities in the airspace, in the beyond visual range environment. And the beyond visual range environment is incredibly important because live virtual constructive is undoubtedly how we ultimately solve this problem. But right now, it's a 50% solution. And it's a 50% solution because it only works beyond visual range. So allow me to expand on that and sort of clarify a little bit, because as I said, you've seen Top Gun, so you kind of got the visual stuff, but the role of a fighter pilot is actually twofold. Out at range, we are, I guess, 3-dimensional chess players, tacticians. So we're sitting here, let's say there's a threat aircraft at the other end of the stage, and that's 100 miles away. And so I sit there and I'm working my radar systems, I'm working my defensive systems, and we're taking shots at each other, and those ranges are closing. Now let's assume I'm half competent at my job and the individual I'm going against is half competent at his or her job on the other side. Well, over time, those ranges start to collapse. And at around about 10 nautical miles, the role of a fighter pilot changes completely. And the role of a fighter pilot goes from three-dimensional tactician chess player to you're putting the proverbial gum shield in and you're going for a fist fight. And that's the kind of stuff that if you've seen Top Gun 1, Top Gun 2, whichever one is your favorite, where you start to get into the visual maneuvering and dogfighting. And that stuff is a very real problem still to this day. It happens, and anyone that argues otherwise is simply wrong. And we can talk about that in the bar as well. But what happens with LVC, when we get to that 10 nautical mile range, the pilot transitions from looking down at our displays and sensors to looking out of the window, and at that point, the entire LVC ecosystem collapses. Why is that? Because there's nothing there. And there's nothing there. Why is that? Because there's no way of putting virtual or synthetic entities into the field of view of the pilot and have them behave in a manner commensurate with how real airplanes would behave and interact. Why is that? Because so far, no one took the time to figure out how to make augmented reality work outdoors in dynamic environments up in the sky at 400 miles an hour. Well, we have. And that's exactly what we've been working on at Red 6. And the story goes like this. In 2017, when I should have been focusing on really much more serious stuff, I decided to build an airplane from scratch. An absolutely irrational decision. And I'm sitting in my hangar one day building this airplane, and into my life walked three individuals. And Glenn Snyder, just put your hand up, Glenn, so you know you can talk to him. Glenn walked in, and we were introduced. And I said, hey, Glenn, what are you working on? And so Glenn, in 2015, had pulled off a world first in virtual reality, in that he took, and it was super cool, he took two race cars, put them on two separate racetracks at the same time, with real race car drivers in them. I believe one was in the UK, one was in the US. He put real race car drivers in, created a virtual reality environment, and both race car drivers put a helmet on, were able to see each other in a volcanic molten ash sort of world, and even they were on separate racetracks at the same time, they were able to race real race cars completely blind to the outside world against each other, around racetracks, which I thought was pretty cool. And when I saw it, I said to Glenn, have you done anything with this? And I guess he hadn't at the time. I said, I have an idea, Glenn. So I called the Air Force up and I said, hey, live virtual constructive, I think I'm about to solve all your problems. I think I'm about to save you billions of dollars a year, allow you to train against any threat you want, and here's how I plan to do it. And the Air Force said to me, is that real? And I said, yes. And it was a PowerPoint, I think, like all good entrepreneurs at the time. And I said, yeah, it's absolutely real. We'll figure this out. And they said, okay, we're going to come see you. They didn't believe us. So I went back to Glenn. And I said, hey, Glenn, two questions for you. Can we do this in airplanes? We scratched our heads for a couple of weeks and came up with a yes. We think so, technically possible. And the second question I ask is, no one is going to allow fighter pilots to fly around in virtual reality, so can we do this in augmented reality? And Glenn looked at me as if I was absolutely insane. And he said, no. And I said, why, Glenn? He said, because augmented reality doesn't work outdoors or in dynamic environments. To which I said to Glenn, well, we better figure it out because I've just promised the Air Force it does. And so we set to work. And over the last 3 years or so, we started developing ATARS. ATARS stands for the Advanced Tactical Augmented Reality System. Well, what does ATARS do? ATARS allows real pilots in real airplanes to go up into the sky, drop down into a visor system, which we'll talk about here in a second, and see virtual entities while they are flying real airplanes up in the sky. And for us to do that, there were two fundamental technical problems to solve. One was, how do we track outdoors in dynamic environments? If you put any AR headset on, certainly back in 2018, and walked outside, just down the street at 2-3 miles an hour, the system would collapse, if you could see it at all. And yet I said to Glenn, I need this to work up in the sky, pulling 9Gs, flying at 300-400 miles an hour in a markerless background, whilst we're going upside down. Glenn said, I'll get to work on that. And so we did, and we came up with a different tracking solution for AR that allows us to understand the 6 degrees of freedom in absolute terms relative to the real world, whether we were going upside down, whether we're pulling 9Gs or not. And we came up with a very, very accurate tracking system. And once we solved that, we thought, fantastic, we're going to be billionaires. We'll sell this solution. We'll just go get the best headsets in class. We'll plug them into a flight helmet, and we have a solution. And so we tried to do that. We picked a headset, name one, we tried it. We took them up in the sky, and guess what? They didn't work. And they didn't work because of a number of reasons. Firstly, they wouldn't track and hold a solution. Secondly, even if they did, we couldn't see anything. The benchmarks up in the bright blue sky and a white cloud background are incredibly demanding. You're talking about a 10,000 nit background. Also, for fighter pilots, we're dealing with exceptionally high speeds, so the 30 to 40 degrees field of view horizontally was never going to cut it for us. So we had to develop a system that allowed us to get the field of view out here, because we're ultimately aiming to mimic human vision, and human vision is around about 180 degrees, maybe a little bit more out here. And so we've developed a system now that gives us super wide field of view. And this journey over the last 3 years, the technology has evolved to something incredibly compelling, which I'll show you here in a second. But with the Air Force, when we pitched this to them back in 2018, they didn't quite believe us. And they needed a series of proof points to prove that this was in fact possible. And so the first challenge we were set in 2018 timeframe was, rather than prove you can have aeroplanes flying around the sky in real time, what we'd like you to do is just anchor something in space. And what we'd like you to do is put a cube fixed in the sky in Southern California at around about 5,000 feet that is a framed cube without sides for a very specific reason. And we'd like you to geolocate that in space, lock it into a fixed position, allowing us to take off in a real airplane, go up into the sky, and fly up towards that cube, such that as we approach the cube, it looks and feels and acts like a real entity, a real three-dimensional object. We observe size, we observe shape, we observe heading crossing angle, aspect, closure, all of the things as if a big old cube was hanging in the sky in Southern California. And we made it a framed cube for a very specific reason, and that was to demonstrate the immersive capabilities of augmented reality and just how compelling this solution could be. And it is so compelling that when you fly the aeroplane up into the sky, we drop down into the visor, you see the cube in the distance. As we fly up to the cube and it gets bigger, we start to enter and fly through the cube. And because it's framed, i.e. no sides apparent to us, it is such a compelling solution. And I know it sounds ridiculous that I am careful not to hit the wings of the airplane on the sides of the cube as I fly through it. And as we fly through it, we roll upside down, and the cube fixes in space as if it were a real object. We demonstrated that to the Air Force in 2019, I think, at the beginning of 2019 and 2018. And the Air Force were blown away. And from a technical developmental perspective, I understood that that was very significant, and from an engineering perspective, incredibly, incredibly impressive. But I also knew that for operators, whilst we'd think that was cool, what we'd really find cool was, could we make airplanes fly around real time in space? And so when the Air Force came out to see us in 2019, we took them to the cube, we flew them through the cube. It was incredibly impressive. And then we said, check this out. And sitting on a racetrack in the sky was an augmented reality KC-46 tanker flying around the skies of Southern California. And we were able to fly an intercept on this airplane, pull up alongside it, and observe everything that I would do as a fighter pilot to refuel. And it was the basics of the early concepts of the headset that we're developing, so it wasn't stellar quality, but it was sufficient to prove that this was actually a viable proposition. We could put virtual airplanes and have them behave commensurate with real airplanes up in the sky, and with that, we ushered in a fundamentally new paradigm in how we are thinking about training in the future. The early days of the headset, frankly, were quite laughable. I mean, we were pulling things apart, ripping things apart. Glenn was hot gluing them to my head. I had chunks of hair pulled out, buns all over me. I looked like Harry Potter. It's been an emotional journey flying that airplane with Glenn, I can tell you. But over time, the technology, not least led by some of the guys in the front row here, has evolved to the point now where we have such a compelling headset that it really has moved the ball down the field for what is possible in terms of outdoor augmented reality. So this is the latest version of our headset. We call it EVE. EVE stands for the Enhanced Visual Environment. And it's on display, I think, in booth 732. And there's a demo there with a ride-along. We'd encourage you guys to go along and see it. But this headset is an 18,000 nit headset with 160 degrees field of view, working right now. 14 cycle degrees per resolution, 50% transparent, and the motion to photon latency in this and the broader network stack is around about 35 milliseconds. And of course, latency for us in those dynamic environments is incredibly, incredibly important. So this is what we're flying with and going to be delivering next year. This, guys, is footage from inside of the headset itself, our current version of the headset, in fact. This is from correct me if I'm wrong, 3.0, Glenn? 2.7. So this is one of our earlier versions of the headset. This footage is not rendered. It's not doctored. It's absolutely complete raw footage, so much so that it's shot with an iPhone sitting inside a visor as one of my pilots is flying around up in the sky. And what you can see there is a Chinese J-20 alongside a KC-46 flying up in space. The behavior of these entities, there's three ways to control them. We can either do scripted behavior, i.e. give them protocols to which they fly and interact with us. We can do virtually, which we'll get to in a second when we talk about the next stage of development, i.e. connected into game space with a human being at the controls. Or we can do the full-up solution, which is AI-driven, fully immersive bandits. And what we're seeing now and what we're flying against are AI-driven algorithms that think and fly and fight for themselves. So what I'm saying, if you ponder that, what we're actually talking about is being up in a real airplane, dropping down into an augmented world and seeing augmented reality airplanes up in the sky that are thinking and flying and fighting for themselves. It is the craziest thing. So I'm in a real airplane dogfighting something that doesn't exist, that's thinking for itself. That is incredibly important for us as a nation and as a military because it's ushered in a fundamentally new paradigm. The thing with what we're doing and what we developed in ATARS, however, is that it's a a single airplane solution. So what I mean by that is I can go off in a real airplane and up into the sky, and if I would traditionally wanted to do 2 aircraft against 2 aircraft, what would historically cost me $400,000 per flight hour, 4 airplanes and 4 pilots, I can now do with 1 airplane, 1 pilot, a virtual wingman thinking for himself, and 2 bandits out there that are thinking for themselves flying against us. And they will make decisions that are absolutely commensurate with the best fighter pilots I've ever flown with. It's really eye-watering to see. So that was the first deliverable. The second deliverable after that was something called Carbon, because as fighter pilots, we don't go fly and train by ourselves. We go up in formations. And so if we go up in formations, we need to be able to fly in formations. So we developed, the next iteration of that was Carbon, the combined augmented reality battle space operational network. And what Carbon enables us to do is take a protocol and connect multiple airplanes into common game space. So we've created a super low latency RF mesh network in the Southern California region, which allows us now to take off in a couple of airplanes, go up into game space, and interact into what we think is the world's first multiplayer video game played outdoors, certainly up in the sky. Technically, incredibly significant. The beautiful thing about this is the protocols that the guys have developed, because latency is such an issue for us, it's a super smart protocol that makes the aircraft that is closest to the aircraft or the rendering and the entities we're training against, the aircraft that is closest to them hosts the generation of that data and passes it through the network. So it's incredibly dynamic in how it switches information from one airplane to the next. We actually flew the first iteration of Carbon about 2 weeks ago. And what you're seeing here is something that's incredibly significant, because this is the first time outside of the company we've ever shown this. And what you're seeing here is from a pilot's visor, you're seeing a pilot flying a real airplane up in the sky, looking at an augmented reality KC-46, against which in formation, another pilot is flying a similar airplane. So 2 weeks ago, Carbon started to work and come alive. So what that means now is we can connect multiple game players into game space, into a common augmented environment. The next interesting thing about this is we talked about 3 ways of controlling it: scripted, through AI algorithms, but also virtually. So in Santa Monica now, we have a sled deck with a virtual reality helmet, and you're able to put an individual or a human being in game space on the ground in a virtual reality helmet, controlling avatars of themselves up in the sky. And as they're controlling avatars of themselves up in the sky, the real pilots in the real airplanes are fighting against them. And if we go back to the earlier definition of what live, virtual, and constructive means, we've now solved virtual and constructive as a 100% solution. And with that, ushered in something incredibly important for the US military. So how does this all link to the military metaverse? Well, if you think about ATARs as the gateway into an augmented world, you think about carbon as the connective tissue that connects multiple players into an augmented world, how do we start thinking about this in the context of the metaverse? Well, if you go back to the previous definitions of synchronous, persistent, and data inside the metaverse must have actionable consequences in the digital realm and indeed the real world, we can start to apply that to the fundamentals of how we now think about training. And for us as fighter pilots or operators in the real world, when we go and operate on operations around the world and we will prosecute a mission, we prosecute a mission and that mission has an effect. We may blow stuff up, we may lose assets, but ultimately we are left with the consequences and the outcomes of that mission. Conversely, when we train, it's impossible for us to do that. And so the way we would historically train is we'll take ourselves up into the sky, we'll go be given a mission, we'll fly that mission, and once we've flown that mission, we come down and we land and we will debrief that mission real time. And we'll take the lessons learned and we'll take all of the goodness from it. But ultimately, the next time we go up to fly a mission, the mission is fundamentally different. We are not left with the outcomes or the consequences of that first mission. Well, now with the metaverse, we can. If it is persistent and synchronous with real life, now we can create a living, breathing world inside of the metaverse that is running all day long and all night long, whether we're inside of it or not. And that now changes the rules of the game for training. It allows us to go up into the metaverse and fly our first mission. Let's say it's night one of the war, we go up, we prosecute the mission, there are a set of consequences. We come down from that mission, the next wave goes up, and they are left with the outcomes of what we've processed and what we've executed against in the real world. That's incredibly significant for us, because that now allows us to do multi-day campaign-level training over a period of a number of weeks. It is a living, breathing world up in the sky, and this is working in Southern California right now. Before I get to a video to show you this, the next aspect of what we do up in the sky, obviously we take that up there, we have to take lessons learned, and we have to come back down onto the ground and debrief those lessons learned effectively. So we developed a system called Arcade, and this is where we now start plugging virtual reality into the overall ecosystem of what we've built. Augmented reality outdoors in the most dynamic of environments. But we need to be able to take the results of that mission and down into the debrief, and now we're able, through Arcade, to put a virtual reality headset on and, in essence, refly the mission itself. And because of the accuracy of the solution we've had to provide to the pilots up in the sky to present data to them that makes sense in real time, the accuracy of that system allows us to extract a data set from the pilot that we can now pipe down into the debrief and start to do some really deep-level analysis. And that analysis allows us to extract a set of lessons learned, which for us, day in, day out, is what we're about. How do we continually improve human performance? And this gives us insight into a level of human performance that we've never had before. When we as instructors go into the debrief, the art of instruction is to understand contributing factors and root cause analysis as to why human beings make the decisions they make under stress and duress. But inevitably, there's a degree of subjectivity to that, and to the best will in the world, we're highly trained, but we miss things. We don't quite get things correct. Well, if we can start to understand the cognitive loads that are on an individual operator at any one point in time, we can now start to do a level of debriefing that informs some fundamental questions. Questions as fundamental as, what makes a good fighter pilot? Where do we find these guys and girls from? Because the days of us, when we joined the military, the days of us as the kind of the old breed of fighter pilots has changed now. The amount of information coming into cockpits is fundamentally different, and we're looking for this talent pool in different places. And Arcade allows us to do that. Not only does it allow us to do that in the debrief, but it allows people real time to put VR headsets on and enter the metaverse as we are flying up in the sky, and they can join us in that mission and see real time how that mission is going. And because they're able to communicate, they can send orders to us, they can send action orders to us, and it's an incredibly dynamic process, connecting human beings on the ground in virtual reality up to players in game space, up in the real world, flying airplanes. This is how we believe the future of military training will be done, not just for all fighter pilots, but across all domains, because this expands beyond the domain of air to connect all warfighters across all domains. I'm going to finish with a video that I'm about to show you. I think it's from a previous generation of our headset, not the latest one. I will say that the video itself is not doctored, it's not rendered. We're incredibly sensitive to that. So this is shot from an iPhone, which is stuffed up inside a pilot's helmet, as they're flying real world against virtual entities up in the real sky. I hope you find it impressive. Guys, I started the presentation by talking about a use case for augmented reality. What we're doing is a very specific use case, but it's a use case of which we can anchor around very significant technological development. Better training, safer training, on scale, that's absolutely relevant to the operators that this country badly needs. And we do all of this at a fraction of the cost. And this, for us, is a true fundamental use of an outdoor metaverse. Guys, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.